Hey, welcome to Live with BuckeyeGrove.com. This is our first pre-planned episode. Normally, we try to maybe do one after the game, but there is no game this week. I want to thank Griffin, Marcus, and Jacob for joining me here on the show today, and we're going to go about 45 minutes, maybe a little more, a little less. I guess it depends on what we get from people as they jump on the line and ask us some questions, but for those of a lot of people watch this in replay as well, but big news came out this week. No game. I think they're up to 13 games this weekend that have been canceled or postponed. Arizona State, Cal being the latest of those. But we'll get into that in a minute. Just your thoughts maybe on when the news came out about Ohio State and Maryland, that game being canceled. I mean, we were talking to football people 10 minutes prior. I mean, we were talking to Chris Holtman at the time. Things had kind of shifted over, and I see something come across on social. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This is you sit there and you go and you click on the profile and make sure it's not some spoofer or somebody out there just trying to jerk you around or whatever. And I text somebody within the university. They're like, oh no, it's real. And I'm like, oh crap. And lo and behold, here we stand.
Yeah. And, Ryan Day was talking yesterday about his reaction to the news. And he was saying like, he was surprised how quickly that developed. And he was saying, shouldn't be surprised if this type of thing happening because obviously we're seeing it happen so often. We've already seen it happen, with Wisconsin and other teams in the Big Ten. And I kind of feel the same way. I'm like, why was I so taken off guard by the fact that this game was canceled? Because, I should have been anticipating that something like this might happen. But, it's kind of funny to see like everyone on Twitter right after the announcement kind of like concocting these theories about like, well, if Indiana finds a way like not to play Ohio State next week, then they could end up with the sole claim for the East Division in the Big Ten. So I think people are getting a little bit out there because this is just one game missed at the end of the day, and I think a lot of teams might end up missing a game. But I think people need to generally just calm down a little bit with the Indiana conspiracy theories and the everything like that.
I haven't really seen the Indiana conspiracy theories quite yet, but man, that game really needs to go on. I think for Ohio State fans who are looking at this news, it's a positive that it isn't Ohio State who is on this side of the outbreak, because that would mean that, potentially more games in the future would get moved around, postponed, what have you. But now Ohio State is going to have to quickly change the game plan, as Ryan Day mentioned, over to Indiana. And if they take care of Michigan State this weekend, well, we're going to have two undefeated teams in Columbus next week.
Yeah, I think the big thing is here, you never expect it to happen until it happens to you. And I think that's kind of part of why it was so surprising, is that, it did kind of come out of nowhere. But again, we've seen the Big Ten go through this. We saw Wisconsin. They're finally getting out of it. But you never really thought it would happen to Ohio State, because Ryan Day he's pounded it in every time we talk to him. He said, I remind the players every day, one thing goes wrong and we're done. And the fact that it wasn't even related to Ohio State, I think, caused a little more shock here. Also, the fact that it wasn't like a widespread breakout. I think Maryland only reported 8 cases, and there was no rumors, no news before of Maryland having these positive tests. I think that kind of contributed to the shock of when the game was first canceled out of nowhere. But like Kevin said, we were talking to Chris Holtman, kind of shifting over to basketball, and the news broke. And I mean, just looking at the Zoom, people who had their cameras on, you could tell the news broke. Chris Holtman said he was surprised so many people stayed. I was kind of surprised so many people stayed. I think it was the biggest shock of a game cancellation that I've seen, just based on the lack of prior news we had about Maryland.
Yeah, you sit there and the news comes out, and you would have expected there to be some leaks in advance. Maybe we're hearing that this could happen. I ended up talking to Scott Green from our Maryland site, and he said that they'd been hearing some things that potentially could happen. I'm like, hello, I have a phone. You should have texted me and told me that something could have been happened, so I wouldn't have been blindsided the way that I was. And I want to touch upon something that Griffin said. There are these conspiracy theories that are out there that now teams, if you get a game in hand up on somebody, we're not feeling so good. We're gonna sit a couple out to try and backdoor yourself into Indianapolis, backdoor yourself into a very questionable league championship or divisional championship. I see all the things on social, and I'll open this up to anybody who wants to jump on it. We don't necessarily have to go in order here, but I love a good conspiracy as much as the next guy. I really do. I got my tinfoil hat over here near me. I may put it on by the end of the show. We'll see. But, this one just doesn't seem to pass the sniff test, in my opinion. I really don't know if somebody is going to try and get away with saying, well, if we only have to play 6 games and we can get away with, skipping 2 of them to get there. I think it's pretty transparent what somebody would be doing if that were the case. And I would have to assume that there would be some sort of corrective measure put in place. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think I saw, I don't know who tweeted it, but on Twitter, someone said, if Ohio State didn't end up playing 6 games and if someone else in the Big Ten East ended up finishing with a better record, you better believe the Big Ten will find a way to get Ohio State in the championship game. And I know Ryan Day touched on it too. He said that if that were to happen, he thinks there needs to be an adjustment to the 6-game rule. And I mean, it just makes sense. If teams are really going to try to find a loophole in this season, I think there has to be some change made.
It just doesn't sit well with me at all that there's that conspiracy at all. It just doesn't sit well to finagle the system like that. But I know Greg put out a story about Day wanting to reconsider the 6-game minimum. And so just hearing all that, not a good feeling within me.
Yeah, I just think people are too competitive. Tom Allen is in the Indiana team. They're just they're too competitive to let that happen. I think like the year that they're having already this season, I think they would like to play Ohio State and come in undefeated. And they already pulled off. It was the first win against Michigan in like 25 attempts or something like that, I believe it was. They would love to, have an Ohio State win and a Michigan win on their resume in the same season. I mean, why would you, you're kind of playing with house money anyway. There's not expectations, that you're supposed to be in the Big Ten championship. If you could knock off Ohio State, if you're Indiana, I'm sure all those guys would love to do that. So I don't actually think myself that they're going to try to, pull any type of shady dealings to, get out of that one.
Yeah. I mean, if you really believe that you have a good team and, you're going to shock the world. I mean, you're not going to get into the college football playoff by picking and choosing and bobbing and weaving to try and get to that point. I mean, ultimately, you could still get into the New Year's Six and everything as the Big Ten champion. But then again, if you dodge the best game on your schedule, what's to say if you get to Indianapolis? And we're putting a lot of things ahead of ourselves here. You do get to Indianapolis that you're going to get past the Western divisional team at that point. I don't see it. And I know there are plenty of conspiracies going on right now outside of sports and, hashtag stick to sports. I'm not going to get into any of them at this point, but it just seems like sports is mimicking real life at this point. And I think people are looking for something that's not there. I want to jump to one of the questions that we've been asked in the chat, and I welcome everybody to ask us questions here so we can answer them as we are live for 45 minutes here on this show. Trailblazers 85, who those of you on Buckeye Grove know that is Prince Buck Nasty, a good friend of mine. Mm. What does this missed game mean for Justin Fields' Heisman chances? I'll throw that out there to everybody.
It definitely doesn't mean good things. I mean, the fact that he already was coming in playing several less games. I mean, the way that it's done in football in general, stats are looked at in kind of a cumulative fashion. And, despite how many games, if somebody's playing several less games, the stats are just not going to look as good on just like a base eye test level. And I know you have to factor in the difference this year. And it seemed like Justin Fields was picking up a lot of steam in that conversation after the last game. But I think, he was just already playing, fewer games, less of the, no non-conference games to kind of pad his stats either, even though his, stats against the Big Ten teams so far look like, the stats that he might put up against non-conference teams. It definitely doesn't bode well. I think, though, if it's only one game, then it's not a huge deal. If it's 2 games and he's only going to play, 6 regular season games, I think that takes a bite out of his Heisman chances.
I think it takes a big bite out of his Heisman chances if it's more than one game, especially with the Big Ten already being at a disadvantage of playing 8, 9 games. Fields missing more than one is going to hurt. And missing Maryland, just taking a look at some of the team stats here, Maryland was right there in the middle of the pack in terms of Big Ten defense and scoring and yards per game and whatnot. So if Fields does keep it to one game and he continues to play better teams, we'll see how Maryland plays out. But Indiana is a better team. Michigan's going to be a team to watch, whoever they match up with championship week. And if Fields continues to play at the rate that he is, and that competition between his incomplete passes and the touchdown passes stays relatively competitive, that's going to keep him in the conversation for sure.
Yeah, I'll start by let's just look at the rest of Ohio State's schedule. I mean, Maryland, it's a young defense. They've definitely improved, but still, they're not going to really put up a fight against this Ohio State offense. Indiana, much improved defense, but still, I mean, it's an Indiana defense. There's not very much experience or a high level of talent back there. Illinois, Michigan State, they're just bad. They're pretty bad teams. And Michigan, we've seen quarterbacks go at those defensive backs time and time again. So I think just looking at the rest of the games on the schedule, Justin Fields should tear apart nearly every single team. I think it just comes down to quantity, because he won't have the quantity of some of the other Heisman candidates. And we've seen Trevor Lawrence. He's missed a few games. So I think there's almost every team's going to face that kind of thing. But the Big Ten starting later and having less games to begin with, it certainly impacts his chances just based on pure numbers.
Yeah, I will jump in and piggyback off of that. Were we going to send Jacob off in the defense right here?
Yeah, I was going to say, I brought us back to the 4-shot. The problem with having such great contributors who are also students is they're expected to go to class, or at least get on Zoom classes. So I want to thank Jacob for stopping by for 15 minutes to be part of this inaugural show. Jacob, go learn something today. And if you get too bored, you can always pop back on.
I'll see you. Take care, guys.
But yeah, just what I was talking about there was one good positive thing for Justin Fields' Heisman chances is that Trevor Lawrence has been such like a mythical, talked about college football being for the last several years. And I think, and it was kind of the same thing with Tua. You're like, man, how did Tua not win a Heisman? But it really came down to like last year, the injuries, and then Alabama losing a few games, was going to make that impossible. But then this year, everyone expecting it to be Trevor Lawrence. I think that like people would generally would want to kind of push Trevor Lawrence into that Heisman threshold, or put him on that pedestal. And if they were the number one team and they didn't lose all season and he played every game, that very well might have been the case. But the fact that now, even though they lost when he was out, I think that does take a bite out of Trevor Lawrence's campaign. The fact that he missed 2 games, having testing positive for COVID, and now he's missed 2 games, even though he'll probably end up playing more games than Justin Fields, that also, takes something away from his campaign as well, because it's just going to seem, disjointed, missing a couple of games in the middle of the season, unless he comes on really strong and other teams lose.
Yeah, my point is the Heisman Trophy going to the best player who plays the most games, the best player? Is it some sort of longevity award in terms of what you're able to do this season? So, I mean, in this, I can use this to dovetail into the next point I want to make, and I'm going to bring a question from Brian, or a statement from Brian, about moving the season around a little bit. But do you need a team to play 8 games, 9 games, 10 games to really determine who the best 4 teams are going to be out there. And by saying that, do you need a quarterback or anybody? I mean, face it, the Heisman is a quarterback award these years. Do you need somebody to play 8 games to realize it, or can you tell in 4 or 5? And I understand that the more data points you have out there, the more opportunity you have for them potentially to go out there, lay an egg, go against a bad matchup, have Mother Nature fall in the wrong column or whatnot, and things kind of go south from there. Or can you use a smaller sample size to determine who the best player is? Can you use a smaller sample size to determine who the best teams are? Do you need to move the season back a couple of weeks? There was news coming out of the Big 12 that Commissioner Bob Bowlesby there was saying that there have been maybe some discussions, or at least people have thought of the idea of potentially shifting things a little bit. As I said earlier in the show, we have 13 games that have been nixed already this week. What happens if that happens a couple of weeks in a row? I mean, can you sit there and stay in these constructs of having college semifinals on the first and whatever it is, 10 days later playing your championship game? I know I've thrown a lot at you there, so just take what you want from that.
Yeah, I think it's as hard as it is to admit. I think a lot of college football and a lot of the Heisman race at this point it's a reputation game, especially in a shortened season like this. It comes down to what you've seen teams do in the past. The Ohio States, the Alabamas, the Clemsons. They have the faces who are going to be at the top of the Heisman list. They have the teams that are going to be at the top of the college football playoff rankings. Like, you look at teams like BYU, Cincinnati, as charming as they may be, they're not going to get a Heisman winner. They're not going to have a chance at the college football playoffs if the season continues, no matter how many games they play. I think it comes down to playing games against power conference opponents, no matter how many you play. And I think based on what we saw last season, what we've seen throughout the college football playoff, this comes down to the teams that the committee is familiar with seeing, the teams that win year in and year out. Because in the end, those teams are going to create the best games in the playoff. They're going to create the best TV ratings, probably the best gameplay. I think it's just it's known who this group of 4 or 5 teams is each year.
Yeah, and but that's the thing though. It's like you never know. You play 3 more games and you lose one of them, and you could lead to a bad team, and then you're out of the. I think there's no way around it. You know who those teams are, but the more games you play, the more it kind of you get more of an averaged out, mean sense of what the team really is. And so that's why I think it's important. I don't understand why they haven't just already moved back the college football playoff. And I understand there's so much that goes into it with, the TV rights and those, slots and the traditions and this, that, and the third. And I know it's different because it's college sports versus professional sports, et cetera, et cetera. But you've already seen, all these other leagues push things back because it's just what you need to do. And it just doesn't make any sense to me to keep the college football playoff at this fixed date. And didn't they move it back like a week or something already, like months ago?
I mean, no, what had happened was they moved when the selection was going to be, when the selection show, because normally championship week is the first Saturday in December, give or take. And they pushed it back to the 19th. So they did slide it back by 2 weeks to get to that point, because a lot of leagues were going to have their championship games either on the 12th or the 19th, and now the selection Sunday will be on the 20th. But go ahead.
I just think it's unfair to for the college football playoff situation to try to be have it at this fixed date where you're penalizing the other conferences for starting later, and then are you gonna sit there and take away some of the bluster off of somebody's, like a Justin Fields season if he only ends up playing 5 games or something, or be like, okay, that team, they didn't play as many games, they look great, they were undefeated, but they only played this many games because we're not willing to move back the date for the college football playoffs. Just move it back, and then just allow the teams to get that many games, so then you can actually have a fair Heisman race, so you can have a fair college football playoff selection process where you don't have to factor in teams that I think we can all agree that like if you play 8 games or something, like if everyone plays 8 games, that's a pretty good number in my opinion. When you start getting down lower than that, when you get to like 6, 5 games, and there's other teams that maybe are playing 10 games, 11 games, or whatever it is, that just feels like you're just going to favor an 11-0 team over a 5-0 team. You know what I mean? And a player that's put up amazing stats. If they're averaging the same exact stats and the team has the same record and one player got to play 11 games, the other team played 5 games, you're just going to favor one of those things. So I just think there's no reason not to just push it back and just allow a few more data points to get put onto it.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, though. How far do you push it back? How much do you allow to go back? I mean, are we pushing this back a week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks? I mean, at some point, there are diminishing returns at that point. And if you do have a team that had a 10-game schedule or a 9-game schedule and they get through it, do they get to add games? I mean, are they sitting there idle and not building and peaking to play their best football? Again, these are all questions that have to be asked at a much higher level than us 3 guys sitting around here. But, as I'm sitting there and I'm listening to both Marcus and Griffin score very valid points, I'm coming up kind of with counterpoints at this point and saying, but, what is it? I mean, could we be playing a championship game instead of January 10th on February 10th? Or are we saying we're going to throw one more week in there to try and make everything happen, run the semis on the 8th, and then maybe try and do the championship game on the 20th. I mean, I don't have the answers there, but I think with every solution that we find, we create another set of problems.
Yeah, the big thing is we've never seen anything close to this. And you make a very, very valid point about, like, at some point the returns are just not going to be worth pushing it back. But I do think what Griffin said makes sense. Why haven't we at least pushed it back a week already? I mean, there are probably some major logistical things we're not considering here, but it's doable. And if teams are going to miss games as consistently as they've been missing games, there seems to me to be no reason not to at least give a chance to make up games.
And the thing is, like, yeah, the points you made there, Noon, were I wasn't even thinking about a few of those things. And it makes a lot of sense. Like, you can't push it back too far because then things are just going to get, insane. But one thing I will say is, if you started with the premise that you weren't going to be starting the season into, until, remember we were talking about a spring season at one point. A lot of guys were going to opt out, before that was even a possibility of happening. But I will say, like, I think if you were to push things back at this point, the players that have already invested their time into the season, where you're not going to have like I don't think you're going to have the same mass exodus of opt-outs from pushing it back at this point a little bit as you would have, obviously, if they had started with, starting the season January 1st or something like that.
I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. This Maryland game should have marked the halfway point of the season, of the regular season. It is an 8+1 regular season, but we're going to focus on the 8, and it would have been the end of 4 games. Well, they're not going to get the 4 games, so they have 3 in the can. What have been the biggest surprises, whether it be positive, negative, or just observational, about what you've seen out of the team so far? I know we talk about this on the message board. You guys write about it in content or whatnot, but here in just kind of a round table, what kind of stands out, good, bad, or indifferent?
Well, I think the obvious bad, we've talked about it constantly, is the run game. Now, when you look at the stats, I mean, it's not terrible. Master Teague has his moments, but on an overall scale, Ohio State fans are used to seeing J.K. Dobbins, Ezekiel Elliott. They're used to seeing big, explosive plays from these running backs, and it's not something that you've seen so far this year. I mean, even when Teague gets open field, it doesn't look like he has that explosion to break free. Sermon looked okay at the end of the Rutgers game, but there's not that potential for a score every play. And on the opposite end of that, we knew Garrett Wilson was special coming into the season. We knew he was an athletic freak and he makes big plays. But the consistency at which he is being targeted and the consistency at which he is catching balls all over the field, not just down the sideline, not just deep balls, it's been spectacular. I mean, I don't even know how much more you can say about it. He's all over the field. He can play slot. He can play outside. You can tell that he and Fields worked this offseason. You can tell that Fields wants to go to him in the big play situations. I think also a smaller surprise to me was the lack of targets and time we've seen the freshman receivers getting, and a huge part of that is due to Olave and Garrett Wilson getting the majority of the targets, and Jeremy Ruckert stepping up a lot. But coming into the season, this group of freshmen was probably the best in program history for a class. I mean, Julian Fleming, Jackson Smith-Njigba, the talent is spectacular, and we saw that. We've seen that in very limited moments. But I think as we move forward in the season, and maybe there's more time for backups to play, I think we can't really say too much about the depth of this team to this point.
Yeah, I think this season so far really reinforces to me why how last season ended was so kind of heartbreaking if you were an Ohio State fan or supporter, whatever, what have you. Because last year's team, what did we see from last year's team? The defense was like perfect almost the entire season up until the end, and then the offense had struggles early in like first quarters of games, or the offense could be slowed down in the first half of some games we saw early. This offense really hasn't had that issue. This offense, while they haven't put up like a 70-point game or whatever, like you saw from last year's team, they've scored like right off the bat in every game. They haven't had those kind of, you guys remember those first quarters last year where they would get they'd have some weird possessions in the first quarter. That problem is not plaguing this team. But the defense, it's kind of surprising to me that the concerns about Ohio State that people had coming into the season have kind of been reinforced through the first 3 games so far, which is to say people were wondering how is the run game going to bounce back from losing J.K. Dobbins. It hasn't bounced back very well, in my opinion. I actually wrote an article this week about how remember Ryan Day this week was saying, if we run for 200 yards, that's a great number. We don't need to run for any more than 200 yards. But the number that they're running for right now on average would be the third lowest amount they've run for in the past 10 years, and could be even more than that going back, but I just went back 10 years, since 2010. And so that doesn't get the job done, in my opinion, and we've talked about that a lot. And then, obviously, the defense, people were wondering about, losing so much talent on the defense. Is the defense going to bounce back? And I know, the last 2 games, the defense has played really well in the first half of those games, but maybe – if the game's closer at halftime, is the defense better in the second half than what we've seen? That might be the case, and there's still a lot of time to see if that is the case. But the concerns that I have about the team now are the concerns that I had coming into the season. And then I was going to bring this up if Marcus didn't bring it up, but it was such a talked about issue, the freshman wide receivers. It was like this wide is going to be so deep, with all these freshmen coming in alongside Olave and Wilson, but you've barely seen them get the ball and at all. You've got Jeremy Ruckert, the third leading receiver on the team right now, or the third leading receptions leader on the team, which is just unheard of for tight ends. But yeah, those are my thoughts through 3 games so far.
Kind of just piggybacking off of the defensive thing. I think one of the pleasant surprises, is coming into the season, we know who the defensive line lost. Heading those names was obviously Chase Young. That was a big, big question mark for that position group. And I think against Rutgers, the numbers didn't really show it, but I think this group has done a phenomenal job taking over. There has been consistent pressure the past 2 games. You saw what Tommy Togiai could do. I think it's such a deep group that no one's going to stand out like a Chase Young or a Bosa. But I think that this group has more depth than we've seen. They can play a bunch of players. And I think overall, based on, I know it's not up to what we saw last season, but it obviously wasn't going to be that. Based on what we've seen this season, it's been a pleasant surprise so far.
Brian jumping in with another comment. He's surprised that Coach Day hasn't had much of a chance to play Jack Miller and CJ Stroud and Zach Harrison. Well, Zach Harrison has played. I mean, I think what it comes down to there is just a matter of that they're rolling a lot of guys and they're trying to put the right guys in the right situations. As for the young quarterbacks, Ohio State is certainly winning games by large margins, but their second half troubles, especially in the last two games, haven't necessarily made it easy to just say, okay, well, we're done. We're gonna bring in the young guys. I mean, and yes, you want to bring in the young guys and have them run the offense. I mean, having the young guys coming in and then just running student body left, student body right, I don't know if that's really getting them a lot of real world reps or whatnot. And Ryan Day did speak about it. I believe it was this week on Tuesday about, was it this week? I don't even remember. I think it was about the decision to start the second half with Justin and not getting young guys out there. And I know that I was, I talked with Griffin during the game, and I was like, well, no, you need to bring your starter out at least for a series in the second half, see what happens against adjustments and things of that nature. But, what are your thoughts on especially when we're talking about moving from talking about the young receivers to the young quarterbacks, who's going to be the heir apparent to Justin Fields after this season?
I think go ahead, Griffin. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting there at the Rutgers game all ready to bust out my backup quarterback comparison, getting ready to get the first little insight of, who actually might be, making strides, even though, let's face it, against Rutgers, how much really were we going to, read into that? But for the sake of that article, I probably would have. But yeah, I guess CJ Stroud did end up coming out for like the last play of the game or whatever against Rutgers. I didn't even see that because I was, writing or whatever I was doing. But we haven't seen either of those guys throw a pass so far. And even we do our little like 5 questions about the game going into the game. I think one of my questions was which backup is going to have, like a breakout performance or the best showcase. And I probably used a picture of CJ Stroud thinking, we're going to see, Jack Miller and him get to throw the ball. And, Ryan Day even said, despite the fact that he had Justin Fields go out for the first possession and then ended up playing most of the rest of the second half, he did say they talked about not bringing Fields back in the second half. Obviously, that didn't happen because every time Rutgers got the ball in the second half, like 4 out of 6 times or something, they scored touchdowns. So that was it wasn't really possible at that point. But I think they honestly could have put one of them in there for longer. Like, it wasn't the end result wasn't ever really that much in question. You know what I mean? But yeah, those are my thoughts on those guys.
Yeah, I think I don't really have much on this subject. I think we haven't seen enough. I know Ryan Day has said on multiple occasions that it's still a tryout period. We're still going to switch between guys, see who can do what. They haven't played enough to really have one of them stand out, and I haven't seen practice. Obviously, I don't know what's going on there, but it's really hard to tell who's coming after Justin Fields, and I think it might be hard to tell even after this season. I don't know how much time they're going to get. Both of them, obviously, Day trusts to put on the field at some point. He's going to play them both. We'll probably see them both this season. But as of now, I mean, it's way too early to say anything about that.
I'm going to jump in with a question that we were asked over on Buckeye Grove by Mike 11, and he would like to hear our opinions on if we feel if Day has run a vanilla offense to date, and if so, do you think that would have changed if Ohio State would have played against Maryland? And, I'll say, to start things off, Nebraska was a very vanilla type of game, but I think we saw them do a lot more against Penn State. I think they probably dialed it back a little bit against Rutgers. There wasn't, the perception that they needed to go out there and empty the playbook. But I also don't think you need to sit there and while you want to sit there and build off of formations and build off of things that you're doing, it's such a sprint to get to the end, and there's such a, there's no margin for error. You can't go in with, a game plan on a cocktail napkin and say, well, these are the plays we're going to run, and damn it, we're going to make these work or we're going to lose with it. I just think the way that the schedule has gone, Penn State maybe is the only game that we've seen some diversity. And as for Maryland, Maryland was interesting, and I'll get into some of my statistical breakdown on that after I let you guys answer, because I don't want to go off and take all the points away from you guys.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think so. I mean, you talk about the Penn State game. They started off with a jet sweep, to the outside to a wide receiver. And I'm not like an X and O's expert by any means, or even anything approaching that title. But I don't know. I think if anything, we've talked so much about like their 2 tight end personnel and stuff like that this year. If you want to call that vanilla, I mean, if anything, that's almost like unexpected for Ohio State using the tight ends that much. If anything, that kind of goes against the grain of what they've done to a certain extent, and so that it doesn't feel that vanilla, in my opinion. I mean, how many 30+ yard touchdowns have they thrown? So I mean, I don't know if vanilla is necessarily equating to the explosiveness of the offense. I think they haven't been able to get the run game going. But that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, kind of. I have to agree with Griffin there. I don't think it's been vanilla, except for one particular time. The beginning of the Rutgers game. I know you guys saw this too. It really seemed like there was a large effort made to establish the run game. It kind of seemed like they came out and they wanted to force feed the ball to Master Teague. I mean, you could definitely call that vanilla. But as far as everything else we've seen, it might look vanilla, like it might feel vanilla with the short passes to the sideline and occasional deep ball, but that's what you're going to get with Ohio State with this talent that it has. I mean, if you call that vanilla, then it's working. So it might be vanilla, but I think it's what we're going to see.
I don't think we're seeing the crossers as much as we normally would. I don't think we're seeing. I don't know. I think that there's a lot left in reserve, but that's just, that's just the matriculation of the season and how you build off of things, and you need to break tendencies and whatnot. And okay, you've done this 16 times out of this formation. You need to do something else out of it. But as for the Maryland game, Maryland could not stop the run, and that would have been really interesting to see if they would have sat there and said, well, we're going to run Teague and Sermon at you guys over and over and over again. You look at what Minnesota was able to do on the ground against them. Penn State was a bit of an anomaly because Penn State's down 2 running backs with Kane and Brown. But then again, Maryland isn't that much better against the pass either. Maryland had won a shootout in overtime against Minnesota that, hell, could still be going on if Minnesota could have kicked a point after. And then, beat up on a demoralized Penn State team at that point. So I think that there was the potential of them maybe doing a little bit more, but I don't think we're going to come out and see any double reverses or Statue of Liberties or anything out of the Boise State playbook by any stretch of the imagination in that one. I want to jump into another question that Trailblazers 85, again, also known as Prince Buck Nasty on the main board. Do you think Coach Combs is having Wade play so far off the ball? Seems like that would be a strength of his, but instead we see other teams consistently complete passes underneath the coverage. This is one where I'd really like to have Justin Whitlatch, our great analyst, on here. But, do either of you guys have any thoughts about just Shaun Wade in general? I know he's kind of caught a little bit of heat from some fans. I mean, they still remember the 2 catches that Jahan Dotson had for Penn State on back-to-back plays. Rutgers completed a play right there, but I'll be the first to say that I don't think that Wade was playing bad defense on any of those plays. I just think dudes make plays sometimes, and dudes made plays.
Yeah, I mean, Shaun Wade just said to us the other day, he's still kind of adjusting to the distance as well of playing that outside corner a little further away from the ball. And that's kind of what the position. He's an outside guy now. He's not going to be in the box, making plays, covering those slot guys nearly as much. I did honestly think in my head the other day, though, what if instead of moving Shaun Wade to and I don't think Shaun Wade has been, bad either. With a jump ball against Dotson one time. Another time it was, maybe a push off. Last week against Rutgers, it was a jump ball with the tight end. But what if Ohio State just left Shaun Wade at that slot position where he had already shown, so much there? And I get that he wanted to move to the outside and kind of show more complete game, for NFL scouting purposes, and maybe he's just their best pure, cornerback talent in general. And but I was thinking, like, what if they would have left Shaun Wade in the slot, and then maybe you have Cam Brown and Sevyn Banks as your starters? Obviously, Cam Brown went down, but that was a thought that went through my head, and I wonder how that strikes either of you two guys.
Yeah, I think it was a large part of his move to the outside was an NFL move. Wade he's certainly he appears the physically most gifted on this team. He's going to be a professional. He's physical. I think that's why he excelled on the inside so much. He loves to make the tackles, and he said that when he talked to us this past week. But I think the jump from inside to outside, coming from Wade himself, it seems to be a bigger one than most people expected. There's a lot more to take into account than I know I expected. And Wade has mentioned that on multiple times, that he has to learn a different style of tracking the ball, a different style of adjusting to the distance. I mean, there's so much that goes into this that I did not consider. And I'm still a Shaun Wade believer. Obviously, I know we all are. He's going to get used to this, and he's gonna show that he can play both positions. I still think the slot corner is his number one position, and I think maybe he would be having more success if he was still there. But as for how he's playing on the outside, there have been some that he's allowed, but I think overall he's done as good of a job as you'd expect for someone who just switched to the outside.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, Griffin.
I just think if Tyreek Johnson, a 5-star guy coming in, I think if you had him develop, the way that a lot of people thought he might and be more, game ready right now in big moments, then that might have allowed them to, the depth out of the outside to leave Shaun Wade in the slot if you wanted to do that. But I think right now, like, the fact that you don't really have a lot of depth back there, it made it like something that they had to do to move Shaun Wade to the outside.
All I was going to say is I agree with the statement about, that was part of his decision to come back, was to be in that, that big money corner position or whatnot. Again, 2020 is just so weird that there was no non-conference. Really, it was a disjointed ramp up to start, to start practice, to get through practice. You're obviously having to segregate guys in terms of you don't want it to be a case where if somebody gets sick, you lose 20 guys due to contact tracing or whatnot. So, I think that there were a lot of things that were working against anybody who was making a minor position change or whatnot. But I've gone back and I've watched all the games multiple times, and there certainly are a couple of things that Shaun could do this or Shaun could do that. But I challenge you to say, who's outside of Justin Fields? Who's playing damn near perfect? And really, it's Justin Fields and the two main receivers are playing pretty good. But if we're really nitpicking, I could sit there and say, well, that drop probably shouldn't have happened or whatnot. But it just is what it is. It is what it is. But we're coming up toward the end of our time. I got to jump on another radio show here in 11 minutes. So I'll throw it around for one last whip around of any final thoughts here on our first pre-scheduled live show.
Here's just a completely random thought that just popped into my head. When we do our Hot 11 rankings, so our top 11 players on the team, man, isn't it hard to evaluate the offensive linemen? Because, and it's been surprising. The only two guys to grade out as champions so far in all three games on the O-line have been the two starting tackles with Munford and Petit-Frere. And everyone was expecting Wyatt Davis, all decade this summer in the Big Ten, and Josh Myers, Remington Trophy contender and whatnot. But it seems like they are kind of having a little bit a consistency issues to start the season, and that obviously could be has to do with a lot of things. And but man, it's just really hard to kind of evaluate the hierarchy there if you're really trying to rank these guys. Because it's like, can you drop Wyatt Davis after having 2 penalties in a game? Can you drop Josh Myers after snapping the ball over Justin Fields' head? But yeah, that's something that I've kind of struggled with at the start of the season, especially with how the run game has been, kind of lackluster as well.
Yeah, that's something I have an issue with. I think the easiest thing to do is look at the penalties, but I mean that doesn't tell the full story. And unless you're like an analyst, like we have Justin, it's really hard to tell whose fault it was on some of these coverages. But my last thought, I'm gonna go over to basketball. It starts in less than 2 weeks. We still don't have a schedule, but if you're into basketball, this is going to be a fun Ohio State team. There's plenty of moving parts, plenty of new faces. Look for a lot more basketball coverage coming up.
There we go. I was trying to hit the button and wouldn't go. And yeah, just talking about basketball, there's going to be some potential big news coming out tonight. Roddy Gale is supposed to make his announcement at about 6:30 Eastern time. Be sure to keep it locked in at Buckeye Grove for all the latest there. I've already been talking with our basketball recruiting analyst, Jake Spiegel, and he's feeling pretty good about Ohio State's chances, but we won't know until we know. But I want to thank everybody who took part to watch the show either live or who will watch it on replay, everybody who asked questions. I think this went pretty well, and maybe it's something that we can incorporate into our regular schedule more often, more so than just the haphazard post-game situation where Griffin and I are sitting right next to each other and blowing out each other's microphones. But other than that, I want to thank everybody for taking part of this, and we will be in touch with y'all very soon.